Welcome to SurroTalks, a weekly podcast where Kevin, a father of two through surrogacy, and Petra, a former IVF nurse and fertility consultant, unwrap all the aspects of your egg donation and surrogacy journey. Join us every week to discuss various topics around surrogacy and egg donation. On episode 2, we're going to talk about choosing your egg donor, considerations for a known or anonymous egg donor match, the screening process, legal process, and a brief overview of the IVF cycle.
Great to see you. I know we got to see each other on the weekend for our Fertility Friends run, which was great.
I know, it was such a good turnout, even with the rain.
Yeah. And we were checking the latest numbers this morning, and we raised close to $40,000. So
Oh my God.
yeah, it's
Wow.
going to go a long way to help a lot of couples that are facing fertility treatment and need a little bit of extra help. So thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely. I was happy to be there.
And for today's agenda, for anybody joining us, so I'm Kevin Heaney. I'm a father of two through surrogacy, and we will be talking about egg donation. And joining me today is Petra, who was our IVF nurse almost 10 years ago and now works on the agency side and has also been an egg donor herself. So we've got some pretty personal experience to talk about. And yeah, we're excited.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. So today we're going to be breaking down the process of egg donation, and really, dive in deep as much as we can to discuss all the different aspects that you can be prepared for. So the very first part, of course, is to choose your egg donor. So when you sign up with an agency, if that's how you plan to proceed with your egg donation, you will be given access to profiles to review to help you choose your egg donor. Of course, some people are lucky to have perhaps a friend or family member who might be their egg donor, and in which case this would skip this step. But we're going to be focusing more on the agency side of things and how that will all work. So Kevin, tell me how did you choose your egg donor? What did you look for?
So I guess before we got to the agency route, we tried to figure out what was important to us. So one aspect that we wanted was we found a donor that represented both our backgrounds. My background's European. My husband's background is Indian descent. And we actually were approached by a family member who had offered to provide us with her eggs. And the idea was that, we use a little bit of DNA from one partner's background and then the DNA from the other's background in order to have a child that really was a proper mixture of the two of us. Now, we talked about it long and hard. One of the conditions that came along with that offer was that the identity of the donor never be released. And the reason for that was that this person had children of their own. And, you're obviously touching on pretty complicated family situations if you're going with a donor that is related to you. And while we really, really appreciated the offer and felt that it was the most kind gift possible, we actually decided that it wasn't the right decision for us because one day we will be having that conversation with our kids around how they came to be and where, their biological traits are coming from. And we wouldn't feel comfortable not being able to tell them the truth. So as a result, we then decided to go down the agency route. And as you said, we signed up, we got our login password. And I remember it was a Friday night. I logged in the first time. There's 2,200 profiles to go through, and it was pretty daunting. So I poured myself a glass of wine. I just started going through one by one, and you got to start narrowing down one way or another. And so we started with, if I were going to a bar, who would probably catch my eye, and you start going through profiles. And I remember looking for individuals that had very natural pictures posted with friends or family. You really saw a variety of different people across the board. And I tried to stay away of heavy makeup. I wanted to really get a sense of who these individuals were. So finally, I think I narrowed it down to probably about 150 or something like that. At that point, I sent my list and I said, look, now you go through this, you kind of filter down who you would be interested in. And we ended up with our top 20 candidates. From then, we dug in really deep. We looked at medical history that was provided, family history, education. I'm sure the amount of information that's provided varies from one agency to another, but our dossiers were pretty complete. I think as you start reading personal essays and get an understanding of the person, you start to create connections. And we narrowed down on three top candidates because there's always a chance that these individuals are no longer available or had donated previously and may not be at a position where they can donate. So we were very lucky. Our top choice was actually available, and we proceeded pretty quickly. So that was how we came to select our donor.
So you brought up a lot of really good points of kind of what information is provided and what you found important to you. So I know that you started kind of with maybe ethnicity or race. And some families may be very specific in terms of, wanting a donor whose family is from a specific country or region. And then, there's obviously the physical attributes that some people are going to be looking at as well. Maybe you want to find a donor that looks like you, or maybe it's just like you said, somebody who catches your eye. And then, sometimes education is very important to people, and they want to find somebody who meets a very specific education requirement to show perhaps their IQ level. And then some people are very interested in the medical side of things and the family history. And these are all, this is all very important information that should be included on the profile. And I encourage you, when you're looking for your egg donor, to always ask questions. And if there's something missing from your profile that you really want to know about, or something you want clarity on, or maybe if you want more pictures from different points in that donor's life, these are all things that you should feel comfortable asking from your agency.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the questions you can ask too is whether this donor has donated previously, because there is going to be the potential of your children having half siblings out there in the world.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that the type of information that the agencies are able to share?
Yes, and it does depend on, how much information you're looking for as well. So we're not always able to share perhaps geographic locations of the parents or the clinic that completed the cycle. But we can certainly look into and usually have on record the donation that took place and how many eggs were retrieved. And we always like to ask for, the fertilization information and pregnancy information from that donation. Sometimes we're limited to what we can get depending on what the previous parents have consented to share as well. So, but these are all really good questions to ask and good information to have, especially if your clinic and your physician is able to review that information. So one of the things that we like to do is gather all of the medical records and send it to the new IVF clinic that you're matched with, so that, the doctor can look at what screening has been done. Has there been any genetic screening done already that will give you more insight to what you might need to be tested for? And also, what was the protocol used for their medications during the stimulation cycle? Because that could give really good insight into, okay, this medication protocol worked really well, so we should try and replicate that. Or maybe this could maybe be adjusted so that we could have a better outcome for the next donation.
I remember when we were going through the process being amazed at the drug regimen for the donor. If I recall correctly, it's much more substantial than it was for the actual surrogate.
Yes.
Uh,
Well, depending on how you look at it, I guess the donors, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but the donor will have to do multiple injections a day for about a 10 to 13 day period, whereas your surrogate will maybe have an injection per day for the first trimester.
mhm.
So that's 12 weeks.
Yeah.
So depending on how you look at it, yeah, they're both very, they are medicated. The donors certainly can feel the effects of that medication, as can the surrogates in different ways. But it is a big commitment to her, for
Yeah.
her rather.
So say, you've now selected kind of your top three and you've narrowed down your top donors. Can you walk us through a little bit what that process looks like?
Yeah. So you've narrowed down your top three. Maybe you have donors who have donated before, maybe they haven't. The agency is going to be reaching out to those donors to confirm their availability, and especially if there's any travel involved, making sure that that donor can make that commitment to coming to your clinic for the required amount of time. So we would be reaching out to your donor, making sure all of that, making sure that she has understood the process. And then we will also be communicating with your clinic to make sure that she is eligible to donate with your clinic if they have specific requirements. So at this point, we are engaging the medical team as well as the donor to ensure that this match can move forward. And depending on the results of that, it might narrow down your list, or it might make your decision a little bit harder if they're all available to you.
Yeah. That's a good position to be in.
Yeah, it for sure is. And at that point in time, you can really sit down and figure out what's important to you, and then confirm the match to move forward.
Okay.
So,
And
mhm.
before going to the next step, what if somebody was considering a relative or a friend for donation? Are there certain criterias that make for a good donor that people should consider?
Great question. And I should say that some clinics may have different criteria for friends and family members than they do for agency donors. So this is something to ask your contact person at the clinic. Generally speaking, donors can be between the ages of usually as young as 18 to 32. And you really do need to ask your clinic what their eligibility requirements are, because this can vary. Some clinics will only accept donors above the age of 21, for example, and some clinics may accept donors up until the age of 33 or 34. Otherwise, non-smoking, not using any drugs, no hereditary illnesses and mental illnesses. Their BMI, their body mass index or height to weight ratio must be healthy. So usually this means under 30 or under 32. And they can't usually have any fertility diagnosis. So if a donor, for example, has been diagnosed with PCOS, or if a young lady has been diagnosed with PCOS, most likely she won't be able to be an egg donor. At every agency does have different requirements as well that they look for beyond that. I know that some agencies might be very considerate of mental health as well in the past for the donor, as well as, past traumas and that sort of thing, to ensure that she is in a stable place of mind to be able to, do this donation in a healthy way, from a psychosocial perspective.
Mhm.
And otherwise that she's a healthy young lady. So these are all different things that are considered when an egg donor applies to an agency to be an egg donor.
Great.
Other factors are going to be the medical factors that will come through the screening process. And these include blood tests to test her hormones to make sure that she is a good candidate from the fertility perspective to be an egg donor.
Great. During the screening process, is there anything that the intended parents need to do?
Yeah. So as when you're preparing for the egg donation from your side of things, and this may happen before you've even selected your egg donor, intended parents will need to do infectious diseases screening as well as their physical workup. So this will look different, of course, whether it's a same-sex couple or a heterosexual couple or a single person, male or female. What is needed. So first of all, you're going to be tested to make sure that you have no infectious diseases as per the Health Canada requirements.
Mhm.
And then second of all, of course, you're going to be tested for your fertility. And so as a male, this may look like the semen analysis, as well as applicable hormones to make sure that you're in a healthy spot to be providing your sperm for the IVF cycle. And, if there's maybe any question about the quality of sperm, then some men are going to be prescribed vitamins or different medications to improve that. And that might be a several month process to get the numbers good. As a female, if a female is undergoing egg donation, as a recipient, we're going to be looking at her fertility in terms of carrying the baby, and whether or not you're going to be deciding to pursue surrogacy after this will obviously determine the need for that. But she's going to have hormonal testing and then usually ultrasound investigations to make sure that everything's okay in the uterus to help carry a healthy term baby.
Mhm.
Another aspect of the screening is going to be the counseling. So you will be recommended to have a counseling session, usually with a social worker or a family therapist, to go through all the different aspects that we're actually going to be talking a lot about today, but a lot of the different emotional aspects of working with an egg donor and talking about, like you were talking about, Kevin, how are we going to talk about this with our future children? How are we going to talk about this with our family or friends, and going around, all of those different conversations that you're going to be having, not only with your own partner, but the people in your social circles and in your family. And so
Yeah.
that's a very important part of the, I would say, quote unquote, screening process before you enter an egg donation as well.
And one of the big aspects, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit later too, is whether you choose to move forward as a known donor or anonymous donor.
Yeah.
That obviously is a big.
Your counselor will definitely help you, not necessarily decide, but she will ask you some very good questions to help you start that conversation and learn a little bit about maybe what to think about in terms of making that decision.
Mhm. Great. So screening's done. Everything looks good. What are the next steps? I guess we start the legal aspect now, right?
Yeah. Well, let me talk a little bit more about the egg donor screening.
Okay.
So when you have chosen your donor to move forward with, the clinic will engage her to book her screening appointments. There's going to be a number of appointments that she will have to attend. Some will be virtual and some will be in the clinic. And some might be even at a satellite clinic if she's far away and cannot travel to your IVF clinic for the screening. When she comes for the screening appointment and has all that physical testing done, she can expect similar tests that the parents will have to go through as well. So infectious diseases screening, hormonal screening, genetic screening, and a physical assessment. With the hormones, one of the tests that she's going to do, which you will start to become very familiar with, is her AMH test. And this is a really important marker for fertility for egg donors to make sure that she can donate for you while not affecting her own fertility, but also providing a great number of eggs for you to use. So the AMH test is the anti-Müllerian hormone, and you will become very familiar with this, I'm sure. And it basically will give us an idea of the donor's ovarian reserve. So all of those little eggs will produce this hormone, and the test will give us an idea of how many eggs she might produce during the cycle. So your clinic will have a cutoff of what's the minimum level for the AMH. Usually this is a 15 in Canada, which really doesn't mean very much in terms of the actual number. And it doesn't mean she's going to produce 15 eggs. It doesn't mean she has 15 eggs, but it is a signifier that she's going to be able to produce a healthy donation for you.
Mhm.
Some clinics will also have different packages that you can choose from, which may have different AMH requirements. So some clinics have, for example, what's called a guarantee package, which provides you with a guarantee that you will either have a certain number of embryos to work from, or that you will end up with a live birth, a baby at the end of this, or maybe just a pregnancy. So sometimes with those guarantee packages comes higher expectations of the egg donor and her fertility levels. So this is something to look into as you're choosing your egg donor. Other tests that they're going to do are her hormones that fluctuate during the cycle, like her FSH and her estrogen and progesterone and LH. And these tests will all give the doctor a good idea of whether she's healthy in terms of her fertility, and that she's producing a healthy number of eggs. So those tests you're going to become very familiar with. Otherwise, she is going to have ultrasound as well. One of the terms that you might hear from the ultrasound result is the AFC, or antral count. This is an ultrasound typically done at the very beginning of the menstrual cycle, usually on the second or third day of the donor's period. And it gives us an idea of how many eggs are available to stimulate per cycle. So at the very beginning, the ovary will have lots of little follicles, which have the possibility of maturing an egg. Typically on a natural, unmedicated cycle, the body will only focus on one egg. But if there's lots of follicles there, those follicles can all be stimulated. So your doctor is going to be looking for a good antifollicular count to make sure that she has lots of eggs there to stimulate. And this goes hand in hand with the AMH levels as well. Another aspect of the screening is going to be the genetic screening. Some clinics will do genetic screening on the intended parents first. Sometimes they don't. Often they don't, unless there is something in your family history that will prompt that. But typically how it will work is that the donor will do a genetic screening, sometimes just based on her ethnicity, or sometimes they'll do a full panel of hundreds of different mutations to make sure that she is not a carrier of any mutations that can cause a condition in a future child. If a donor comes back positive as a carrier for a condition, that means that she has a quiet gene that, if matched with a parent who also has that quiet gene, can produce an offspring with an active condition.
Hmm.
So it's usually only if a donor has that carrier status that an intended parent will be tested as well for the same mutation. And that would be the sperm provider who's going to be doing that test. Sometimes if you're looking at profiles, it might be listed that a donor is a carrier of something already. This is probably because she's donated before and that has been identified. So if you do see that, definitely ask your doctor and your agency about that. And perhaps you may, as a sperm provider, need to be tested for that condition too. So that's pretty much everything that's going to go into the screening process. It's quite a lot that she does, but most of the time everything can be done in one day. And then we enter a bit of a waiting period for all of those test results to come back. Typically, the hormonal and infectious diseases blood work may take about 2 to 4 weeks to get all the results back, whereas the genetic screening can take about 8 weeks almost to come back. So that's kind of the longer one that we would be waiting for. Once everything's back and the doctor has reviewed it, then the donor can be medically cleared, and now we can start with the legal process.
And that's the next step.
Yeah, so that's the step. I would say, just to recap, step 1 was matching with your donor. Step 2 was the screening process, and now step 3 is your legal process. So at this point in time, you can retain a lawyer to draft your donor agreement. So your lawyer, if your donation is occurring in Canada, then you will be working with a Canadian lawyer to draft the agreement. And the donor will also have a lawyer to represent her, make sure she understands what she's signing and agreeing to, but also make any negotiations to change the contract if needed. This might take about 2 or 3 weeks to go through the legal process. However, sometimes we get a rush where we might have to have the legal agreements done by a certain date. And I've seen legal agreements be very, very fast. It can be done in 2 to 3 days if we really, really need to. So do you remember your legal agreement, Kevin, at all?
Yeah, so we worked with an agency out of the US, but we still got legal advice out of Canada. So the donor's lawyer, I believe, was out of California, and our lawyer was here in Canada. We opted for an anonymous donation. So the only factors that were identifying us in Canada, I think, were the last 3 digits of our social insurance number, but there's no other personal information disclosed. And same with the donor. In her case, I guess it would have been her social security. So that was interesting. But we definitely had legal advice in Canada, and the donor had legal advice in the US. And I would say it probably took about 2 weeks.
Yeah. Do you remember anything that stood out, like anything that stands out to you now on that agreement?
So while we decided to go for anonymous donation, what was important to us was that when the children turned 18, they, if they wished to, had the opportunity to reach out to make contact. Again, this is 10 years ago, so technology has changed quite a bit. There are other avenues today to try and make contact, whether it's doing a 23andMe genetic test. A lot of people are finding either half siblings or donors making contact through there. But at the time, we really wanted to have some kind of formal process where the kids could one day try to reach out to their donor, knowing very well that if the donor does not wish to have contact, that is not possible. But it can be started from the kid's side. What we also, I think, agreed to was that it could never be, the process could never be engaged from the donor side. So it would always have to be initiated by the children,
Mhm.
and then the donor would have to agree to create contact. But again, with technology today, I think, things are very different. And even though you may choose to do an anonymous donation, the reality is there's other ways today where that can change. And
Yeah.
so having that conversation too, in terms of what will we do one day when, if this information comes up, and talking to your counselor about that, I think is really important.
Yeah. There's so many ways on the internet to really find people, and it's not something that we necessarily encourage. I think, it's best to go through the legal teams to do this and go through it the right way.
Mhm.
But it is important to know, and important for donors to know, that there are ways of finding people.
Yeah.
And what you're referring to is often called a semi-anonymous donation. So when there's something in the contract that shows that the children can reach out to her when they turn 18 if they wish. Otherwise, your contract will be strictly anonymous or strictly a known donation. And for the big difference for the known donation is that everybody's full names are going to be on the contract.
Have you noticed a change in, the demand for anonymous or semi or known donor over the years?
I think that there has certainly been an increase in known donations, and I've noticed that there are donors who prefer to be known, or at least have some information about who they are donating to. And so this has been a change I've noticed in the last 10 years.
Hmm.
Um, I've also noticed that some agencies do really encourage known donations to foster those relationships. So, at some agencies, you may find more donors who prefer to be known, whereas other agencies might have more often anonymous donations.
Hmm.
This is something that you might want to ask when you're first starting to work with an agency, if that's something you already know, if you're leaning to one side or the other.
Yeah, one other great piece of advice I think would be, there's so many support groups on Facebook. Try to sign up and educate yourself. Try and get perspectives from donor conceived people, and what their experience has been growing up, um, as being a donor. I've definitely learned a lot over the past 10 years. It's probably helping me shape my conversations with my kids. We haven't really entered that stage, but it's coming. Our daughter's starting to ask a lot more questions about where her eyes come from. And kids at school are starting to ask questions because, well, she does have two dads, and, well, how does that work? So I think the more education you can do up front, and learning, the better you'll be prepared to make these decisions and eventually, deal with whatever questions are coming your way, because they will.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, a lot to think about when making that decision, certainly.
Yeah. So then once legal is completed, there is the IVF cycle. And I know we're not going to dive down too deep, because that will be the topic of another episode. But
Mm.
can you maybe give us a very brief overview of what that would look like?
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk about, like, kind of high level how that will all work. So the donor will be given a calendar or a plan by the coordinator at your IVF clinic. Typically, once legal is done, it will be the plan for her to start her injections on her next menstrual cycle. So what she can expect and what you can expect is that usually on the second or third day of her menstrual cycle, she would be going to the clinic to start her medications, do blood work and ultrasound, make sure that everything's ready to be started. She will get teaching from the nurse there to be shown how to do her injections. And then she will be actually sent home with all of her medications to continue doing those on a daily basis. At this point, typically her appointments will be scheduled over the next 2 weeks. So usually after she starts her injections, she'll return to the clinic 4 or 5 days later. And again, she's doing injections every day at home in that time. And then she'll have blood work and ultrasound. This is called cycle monitoring to see how the injections are working and whether her doses need to be adjusted. And what they're looking at is the growth of those follicles that contain the eggs, making sure lots of those follicles are recruited and growing. At this point, she's going to be coming in every 2 to 3 days after that first appointment. Again, always doing her injections at home or with the clinic, and then doing the cycle monitoring to monitor the growth of those follicles. She can expect to be doing that for about 9 or 10, maybe 11 days. And then the doctor will decide when she's ready to be triggered. So the trigger is an injection that's given 35 or 36 hours before the scheduled egg retrieval. And this means she's done her last injection. Usually it's one that's done late at night because the retrievals are done usually in the morning or midday. And she takes this trigger shot, which will basically do that final maturation and release the eggs so that they can be retrieved during that procedure. She'll have 1 day off with no injections. And then on that retrieval day, she'll go to the clinic. She'll be hooked up with IV fluids, and she will be going under sedation. It's called conscious sedation during the procedure itself to remove the eggs or retrieve the eggs. She shouldn't remember anything from that procedure. It should be painless. Usually most donors will fall asleep. If they don't fall asleep, usually they just don't remember really what happened because of those good medications that they give. And then after that, she's going to recover a little bit at the clinic, and then she will be taken home by a companion. She won't be able to drive home. On that same day, when the eggs are retrieved, they will need the sperm to fertilize the eggs. So the sperm may already be at the clinic frozen, or the sperm provider may be asked to come to the clinic that morning to provide a sample so that they can fertilize those eggs fresh with fresh sperm. At that point, this is where the actual in vitro part starts, and the eggs and the sperm will be fertilized in the lab. And as intended parents, you can expect to receive a couple of updates throughout that process of fertilizing the embryos and watching the embryos grow. So depending on the clinic, you might get updates every couple of days or on a daily basis to get that fertilization and embryo report. So we'll get into the real science of this with Dr. Roumain, but day 0 is the day of the egg retrieval. Day 1 is the following day, and that's when we'll know how many eggs have been fertilized successfully. And then typically the embryos are going to be growing in the lab for 5 to 6 days total. And then they're going to be ready to be frozen. And this concludes your egg donation cycle.
I remember when we were going through it, it can be a very big surprise how many eggs you actually get on retrieval. Correct me if I'm wrong, but between 15 and 20 would be ideal. Having more eggs is not necessarily a better outcome. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll let one of the doctors get into the real specifics of quality in this regard, but I was always taught that 15 to 20 eggs is an ideal number for the quality of eggs that you will get. But the expectations have kind of grown, especially if you're a same-sex male couple with two sperm providers providing sperm for the eggs, then they probably were going to aim to get more eggs than that.
Mhm.
The technology has really, really improved. So we'll let one of the doctors let us know, I think, on another session if we're still getting the same level of quality, if we're getting maybe 30 or, sometimes we see 40 or 50 eggs from one retrieval. So that can, that really varies per egg donor, and it's good history to have. So that's something you might be able to ask your agency too when you're selecting your egg donor, and that might help your decision too.
And no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I did want to add that when your egg donor goes through that retrieval process, all of the eggs from that cycle are going to you. So they're not going to leave any behind. Usually in most arrangements, the donor doesn't get any for herself. So all of those eggs are going to be going to that one recipient family.
Good point. For a bit of background, you actually were an egg donor previously.
Yeah.
Can you maybe talk about your personal experience going through that process?
Yeah, so I was matched twice with two families, and I actually completed 3 cycles. Um, so my first family that I matched with, I did 2 IVF cycles for them. And they're a gay couple that live in Israel. And both my donations were known donations, but the first couple are the ones that I've really kept in touch with, and it has been really great to hear of their success with the egg donation cycle and with their surrogate pregnancy. I actually got to meet their little baby girl when they had come to pick up the baby when she was born. Well, they were here for the birth uh, in New Brunswick, I believe. And then they traveled to Toronto with the baby to get the passport before heading home to Israel. So it was around that time. She was, I think, about 6 weeks old when I got to meet her. And we've kept in touch, and it's been really, really fun to see her growing up. And she's about a year and just over a year now. And she's just thriving, and it's fun to see like the different similarities between her and my daughter as well. So that has been a really great experience. My second donation was for a couple who was more local, and it was a heterosexual couple. It was also a known donation, mostly because as I worked for the agency at the time, it kind of had to be. But we didn't have as much of an ongoing relationship compared to the other parents I was matched with. So I have like 2 different perspectives on that. I'm totally, at ease and comfortable with both of those situations. Some people are going to want their privacy, and that's totally fine. And I'm really happy with that I was able to help 2 families. And yeah, it's just, I mean, it's hard to put into words that feeling of knowing you could help somebody in such a big way.
Well, as a recipient of that, I can only thank people such as yourselves for doing such an incredible gift, because a lot of this would not be possible with incredible people like you. So
Yeah,
without
thank
people
you.
like you.
And
So
there's just so many incredible women, young women who are, open and willing to share their eggs and share that blessing with families. So it's just incredible to see.
and have you thought through a little bit what that future contact might look like, not only for yourself, but for your own children?
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to it. As from my position, I don't want to push anybody either way. I kind of leave it in their hands to update me if they would like to. And I send updates as well, on different milestones. And I hope that we can, continue that through the girls' lives. And hopefully, maybe I'll go to Israel one day and meet them all. I have family there, so it wouldn't be too far-fetched. But yeah, I mean, I hope that I can continue that relationship, but I'm comfortable if that's not how it goes either.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But it triggers some conversations. You kind of wonder, okay, how am I going to explain this to my daughter if she does get to meet her one day? This is kind of a sibling of yours, but kind of extended family, I suppose.
I think that's a good way to put it. Absolutely. And I know we're kind of pushing a little bit on our time, but maybe one last aspect to talk about is the different legalities between egg donation in Canada versus the US.
Yes. So, there's lots of different countries that you can go to for egg donation. I think that the most stable environments are going to be United States and Canada. And there's lots of donors that travel from the United States to Canada for egg donation. Or parents might choose to work with a clinic in the United States for their entire journey, if they have an egg donor that they want to match with there. The main differences between the United States and Canada are that donors in Canada can only receive reimbursement for their expenses related to the egg donation, whereas in the United States, donors can be compensated for their time and effort. So that's going to be the main difference in your legal contract with a Canadian egg donor versus an American egg donor. Obviously, it might affect the expense that you might face as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. Great. Well, I think that wraps up our second episode.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think that, there's so much we can talk about on this topic. So, if you do have questions or if there's anything that we didn't go over that you hoped to hear about, please send us your questions and perhaps we can do a little bit of a follow-up in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. And next week we'll be talking about surrogacy in more detail.
Yeah.
So that'd be great. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I hope you follow along and I hope you guys see us next week. Tune in.
And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out in the meantime.
Great.
Thanks. All right. Talk to you soon, Petra.
Talk to you soon. Bye. Thanks for joining us. Thanks so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe to our channel, and we hope to see you next week.